Master Thaddeus Thorne believed that iron was the only language a man like Gideon would understand. On a humid morning in March 1836, at the Thorn Ridge estate in Georgia, he decided to prove it. He didn't just want to punish Gideon. He wanted to turn him into a living, breathing monument of submission. "You think you're a lion, don't you?" Thaddeus sneered, his voice cutting through the heavy southern heat. "Let's see how a lion hunts with a cage around his throat." The blacksmith hammered the final rivet into a 4-pound, 3-inch wide iron collar. But this wasn't a standard collar. Thaddeus had designed it with 4 jagged, 6-inch prongs extending outward spikes that made it impossible for Gideon to ever lie down, to lean against a tree, or to rest his chin in exhaustion. It was a crown of thorns made of cold Georgia steel. The lock clicked, the weight settled, and in that moment, Thaddeus Thorne made the biggest mistake of his life. For the next 500 days, Gideon became a shadow in the cotton fields, while other men collapsed under the sun. Gideon stood upright. He had to. The spikes wouldn't allow anything else. To the overseers, it looked like the ultimate victory. They saw a man forced into a permanent posture of attention. They saw the skin of his neck turning into a map of scars and sores. They saw a broken man, but they weren't looking at his eyes. Deep behind the exhaustion, Gideon was conducting an experiment in physical and mental limits. Every hour he spent carrying that 4-pound burden, his neck and shoulders weren't just enduring, they were transforming. The iron was no longer a weight, it was a training tool. His muscles became like braided steel cables. His lungs grew larger. His patience became a weapon sharper than any whip. Thaddeus would brag to his guests on the veranda, pointing toward the fields. "Look at him. The most dangerous man in the county, silenced by 4 pounds of metal." He didn't realize that Gideon was counting. He was counting the steps the overseers took. He was memorizing the exact time the whiskey bottles were uncorked in the barn. He was waiting for the 9 men who took pleasure in his pain to be in one place at one time. 9 overseers had taken turns tormenting him over those 18 months. 9 men who believed they were the masters of his breath. But as the sun began to set on October 28, 1837, the wind over Thorn Ridge carried a different scent. It didn't smell like cotton or pine. It smelled like iron, and tonight, the man they refused to guard was finally going to show them what that iron was truly for. To the world, Gideon was a prisoner of the spikes. To Gideon, the spikes were a clock. Every time he felt the sharp prick of iron against his shoulder, it reminded him that the time for mercy had passed. But to understand the terrifying events of that October night, you have to understand the grueling physical evolution that occurred during those 1,200 hours of labor. Most men would have withered under the 4-pound collar. The human neck isn't designed to support constant uneven weight, especially with the threat of impalement if you tilt your head an inch too far. But Gideon was a man of unusual proportions, tall, wide-shouldered, and possessed of a silence that unnerved even the bravest hounds on the Thorn Ridge. By the 6-month mark, the skin beneath the iron had calloused into a thick leathery armor. By the 12-month mark, Gideon had learned to move his upper body with such terrifying fluid precision that the collar didn't even jingle when he walked. He had become a ghost in a metal cage, but the real transformation was hidden beneath his shirt. Carrying that weight while dragging sacks of cotton had turned his traps and lats into knots of explosive power. He wasn't just a laborer anymore. He was a coiled spring. He had discovered that by tensing his neck muscles in a specific way, he could actually shift the center of gravity of the collar. It was no longer a burden he wore. It was a part of his skeleton. Head overseer Silas Dockery, a man who prided himself on breaking the unbreakable, noticed the change. He didn't see the muscle, but he felt the atmosphere shift whenever he rode his horse past Gideon. It was a coldness that seemed to suck the heat out of the Georgia afternoon. "Why don't you ever look down, boy?" Dockery would bark, cracking his whip near Gideon's heels. Gideon would simply stare straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He couldn't look down because of the prongs, but Dockery mistook the physical constraint for a spiritual defiance. It infuriated him. He began a cycle of extra discipline, recruiting 8 other overseers to help him break Gideon's will. They would take turns keeping him awake at night, poking him with sticks through the bars of his small shack, laughing as he struggled to find a position that wouldn't drive the spikes into his skull. They thought they were playing a game. They didn't realize they were sharpening a blade. Gideon used those sleepless nights to study them. He learned that Overseer Miller had a limp in his left leg when it rained. He learned that Overseer Vance always left his pistol in his holster when he drank. And he learned that on the last Saturday of every month, all 9 men gathered in the tool barn to divide their bonuses and drink imported rye. He knew that the tool barn had only one exit. He knew the wood was old and dry. And most importantly, he knew that the lock on his collar had begun to rust from the salt of his own sweat. On the morning of October 28th, Gideon reached up and felt the metal. It was warm from the sun. It felt alive. For the first time in 18 months, he didn't feel the weight. He felt the hunger. Tonight, the 9 men who guarded the lion would realize that the cage didn't just keep the lion in. It kept everyone else safe from what was inside. The morning of October 28th brought a strange, oppressive stillness to Thorn Ridge. The air was thick enough to swallow a man's breath. Gideon stood in the center of the cotton field, his hands moving with rhythmic, mechanical speed, but his mind was in the barn. He could see it in his peripheral vision, the heavy timber structure, where the 9 overseers would soon gather. For 18 months, Silas Dockery had kept the key to Gideon's collar on a silver chain around his neck. It was his favorite trophy. He liked to jingle it in Gideon's face, a constant reminder that his very breath was a gift from the master. But Dockery had become arrogant. He believed the iron had done its job. He believed the wounds on Gideon's neck were signs of defeat, not the hardening of a warrior. What Dockery didn't know was that Gideon had been feeding the lock. Every day for 3 weeks, Gideon had surreptitiously rubbed a mixture of vinegar and salt into the padlock's keyhole. He used the very ingredients the overseers used to cure the wounds of the whipped. He was using their own cruelty to erode the iron that bound him. By noon, the overseers were already restless. The harvest was ahead of schedule, and the smell of rye whiskey was already drifting from the main house. They were looking forward to the night's festivities. They planned to celebrate the record-breaking season by making Gideon dance a cruel sport, where they would throw stones at the prongs of his collar to see how long he could keep his balance before the spikes pierced his neck. "Tonight's the night, Gideon," Overseer Vance whispered as he passed, striking the iron collar with the butt of his rifle. The vibration sent a shockwave of pain through Gideon's jaw, but he didn't flinch. He just felt the lock. It rattled. It was loose. Gideon looked at the sun. He calculated the shadows. He knew that when the sun hid the top of the oak tree by the well, the overseers would head for the barn. He also knew that the barn's doors were secured with a heavy wooden bar on the inside. If he could get in and drop that bar, the 9 men would be trapped in a cedar-lined oven dot as the dinner bell rang. The overseers cheered, heading toward their sanctuary of vice. Dockery was the last to leave the field. He stopped in front of Gideon, leaning in close, his breath smelling of early bottled rot. "You look tired, boy," Dockery sneered. "Maybe tonight we'll take that collar off, one way or another." Gideon looked him dead in the eye. For the first time in 500 days, he spoke. His voice was a low, tectonic rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The collar is coming off, Master Dockery. But you won't be the one to hold the key." Dockery froze. The sheer confidence in Gideon's tone made his hand instinctively reach for his whip. But the call of the whiskey and the laughter of his men in the distance pulled him away. He turned his back, a mistake he wouldn't live to regret. Gideon waited until the barn door slammed shut. He reached up, grasped the rusted padlock with his calloused, massive hands, and exhaled. With a burst of strength developed over a year, and a half of carrying 4 pounds of concentrated hate, he didn't use a key, he twisted. The rusted tumbler snapped like dry twigs. The collar fell into his hands. He didn't drop it. He gripped it by the longest prong, feeling the balance. It wasn't a punishment anymore. It was a 4-pound mace. And the 9 men inside the barn were about to find out that a lion doesn't need a cage when he has a weapon. Gideon stood in the absolute silence of the Georgia dusk, the iron collar held firmly in his right hand. For the first time in 18 months, his head felt unnaturally light. The air hid the raw, sensitive skin of his neck, a sensation so sharp. It felt like ice. He didn't move toward the quarters. He didn't run for the woods. He turned toward the tool barn, his footsteps silent as a falling leaf. Inside the barn, the atmosphere was a cacophony of drunken arrogance. The 9 overseers were slumped over crates, the flickering light of 3 oil lanterns casting dancing shadows against the walls. Silas Dockery was at the center, bragging about the bonus he'd squeezed out of Master Thorne. They were laughing about the Iron Lion, oblivious to the fact that the lion was currently standing 3 feet from the only exit. Gideon reached the heavy, double doors. With a fluid, deliberate motion, he stepped inside. The transition from the cool night air to the hot, hay-scented interior was instant. He didn't shout, he didn't roar. He simply reached out and dropped the heavy oak bar into its iron cradles. Sell a chique. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the confined space. The laughter died instantly. 9 heads turned toward the door. Through the haze of whiskey and lantern smoke, they saw a silhouette that haunted their nightmares. It was Gideon. But he wasn't bent over, he wasn't cowering, and his neck was bare. "What in the hell?" Overseer Vance stammered, reaching for the pistol at his belt. Gideon didn't give him the chance. In a blur of motion fueled by 500 days of suppressed rage, he swung the iron collar. The 4-pound weight concentrated into a single jagged prong. caught Vance square in the chest before his hand could even touch leather. The sound of ribs snapping was sickeningly clear. Vance hit the wall and slid down, the breath leaving his body forever. "The key is gone, Silas," Gideon said, his voice a calm, terrifying contrast to the chaos about to erupt. The overseers scrambled. Miller lunged for a pitchfork. 2 others tried to rush the door, but Gideon used the collar like a flail. Every swing was calculated. Every strike was aimed at a joint, a throat, or a temple. Because of the collar's design, it was impossible to block. If they tried to grab the iron, the other 3 prongs would shred their hands. Dockery backed away, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. He reached for the silver chain around his neck, the one holding the now useless key. "Gideon, stay. Back. I'll give you anything. Money. A horse. I'll tell Thorne you escaped." Gideon didn't respond. He parried Miller's pitchfork with the iron ring, the metal clanging with a bell-like tone, then stepped inside the man's reach. He wrapped his free hand around Miller's throat, the same throat Miller had poked with sticks for a year, and squeezed until the man's eyes rolled back. The barn was no longer a place of celebration. It was a kill box. The lanterns were kicked over in the scuffle, and the hay began to catch fire. The orange glow illuminated Gideon's face, making him look like a vengeful god carved from the very iron he had worn. He wasn't just fighting 9 men. He was erasing 18 months of humiliation, one strike at a time. With Vance and Miller down, the remaining 7 overseers realized this wasn't a brawl, it was an execution. The whiskey that had fueled their laughter moments ago now made their movements sluggish and their hearts heavy with terror. Silas Dockery, the man who had bragged about breaking Gideon, was now crawling behind a stack of grain sacks, his silver keychain jingling with every panicked breath. "Kill him," Dockery shrieked. "There's 7 of you. He's just one man." Overseer Higgins, a man known for his prowess with a bullwhip, lunged forward with a heavy wooden mallet. He swung for Gideon's head, but Gideon didn't flinch. Thanks to the 18 months of carrying the collar, Gideon's reflexes were honed to a razor's edge. He stepped into the swing, the mallet whistling past his ear, and brought the iron. Collar down onto Higgins's shoulder. The jagged prong didn't just bruise. It hooked deep into the muscle. Gideon yanked back, and Higgins fell to his knees with a cry that was swallowed by the roar of the growing fire. The smoke was thickening now, turning the barn into a tomb of gray soot. One of the overseers, a young man named Caleb, who had often participated in the stone-throwing games, tried to scramble up a ladder to the hayloft, hoping to find a window. Gideon didn't let him reach the 3rd rung. He threw the iron collar. It spun through the air like a lethal jagged discus. The heavy metal ring caught Caleb's ankle, the prongs wrapping around the bone with a sickening crunch. The boy tumbled back into the burning hay, the iron weight dragging him down. The fire was climbing the walls now, feeding on the dry cedar and the spilled oil. The heat was becoming unbearable, but Gideon seemed immune to it. He stood in the center of the inferno, the bare skin of his neck glistening with sweat and ash. To the overseers, he looked like a demon forged in the very fires that were now consuming them. "Please, Gideon." Another man, Henderson, begged, dropping his club. "I have a family. I never hit you as hard as the others." Gideon turned his gaze toward him. "You watched," Gideon said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. In the fields, in the shack, in the rain, you all watched. And tonight, the world watches you. He moved with a sudden explosive burst of speed. Henderson tried to run, but the floor was slick with spilled rye and blood. Gideon caught him by the collar of his shirt, the same way Henderson had once dragged Gideon to the whipping post and threw him into the mounting wall of flames. Only 4 remained now, including Dockery. They were backed into the far corner of the barn, the exit barred, and the roof beginning to groan. The heat was melting the tallow on the candles and the resolve in their souls. They had spent their lives believing that iron and leather gave them power. Now they were learning that power resides only in the man who can carry the weight and stay standing. Gideon picked up the iron collar from the floor, the metal now hot to the touch from the surrounding fire. He wrapped his hand around the ring, the heat searing his palm, but he didn't let go. He wanted to feel the burn. He wanted the iron to be the last thing they ever felt. The 4 men were trapped in the corner like cattle in a slaughterhouse. The fire had claimed the hayloft, and burning embers were falling from the ceiling like orange snow. Silas Dockery, Henderson, and 2 others whose names Gideon had long ago replaced with the sounds of their whips, stared into the eyes of the man they thought they owned. The bar, Gideon. Open the bar. One of the men screamed, his voice high and thin from the smoke. Gideon didn't move toward the door. He moved toward them. Each step was heavy, deliberate, and echoed with the authority of the 500 days he had spent in silence. The 2 subordinates lunged at once, a desperate, final attempt at survival. They didn't use weapons. They used their fingernails and teeth. Driven by the primal fear of the flame, Gideon met them with the iron. He didn't swing it this time. He used it as a shield and a shroud. He caught the first man's throat in the curve of the iron ring and slammed him against a burning support beam. The second man tried to climb Gideon's back, but Gideon's neck muscles, those steel cables forged by the 4-pound burden, didn't buckle. He reached back, grabbed the man by the hair, and flipped him over his shoulder into the heart of the blaze. Now only Silas Dockery remained. The head overseer was slumped against a crate of rusted tools, his fine linen shirt scorched and black. He was clutching the silver key on its chain as if it were a holy relic that could ward off the ghost standing before him. You can't kill me," Dockery wheezed, the smoke rattling in his chest. "Thorn will hunt you to the ends of the earth. He'll put 1,000 men on your trail." Gideon looked at the silver key. Then he looked at the iron collar in his hand. The metal was glowing a dull, angry red from the heat of the barn. Thaddeus Thorn built this place on the backs of men he thought were made of wood, Gideon said, stepping closer. "He didn't realize we were made of the same iron he used to chain us. And iron doesn't forget." Gideon reached out and grabbed the silver chain around Dockery's neck. With a single sharp jerk, he snapped it. He held the key up to the firelight. It was small, delicate, and useless. "You spent 18 months jingling this in my face, Silas, telling me it was the only thing that made me a man." Gideon dropped the key into the bubbling molten rye whiskey on the floor. It disappeared instantly. "Now," Gideon whispered, the fire reflecting in his amber eyes, "let's see how the master's favorite dog likes the master's favorite collar." Gideon didn't use the lock. He took the heated iron ring, the metal soft and pliable from the inferno, and began to force it around Silas Dockery's neck. The scream that tore from the overseer's throat was loud enough to be heard at the main house. Scream that tore from the overseer's throat was loud enough to be heard at the main house. Was loud enough to be heard at the main house. Over a mile away. Gideon didn't flinch as the heat from the iron blistered his own palms. He had carried this weight in the blistering Georgia sun until his skin rotted. A few moments of fire was a small price for the finality of justice. With the strength of a man who had become one with the metal, he forced the glowing ring closed. He didn't need the padlock. The heat had made the iron malleable, and as Gideon squeezed the ends together, the metal fused. Silas Dockery was now wearing the very instrument he had used to torment Gideon, but this time there was no key. The iron was part of him now. "You wanted to see me broken, Silas," Gideon said over the roar of the collapsing roof. "But look at you, you're finally standing tall, just like I did." Dockery's hands clawed at the glowing metal, his fingers blackening as he tried to pull the collar away from his throat. But the four long prongs, the spikes of the lion, now pointed inward and outward, snagging on his clothes and the wooden crate behind him. He was pinned to the structure of the burning barn, a permanent fixture of the Thorn Ridge legacy. Gideon turned away. The heat was becoming a physical wall. The main support beams of the barn were groaning, a deep wooden sob that signaled the end. He walked toward the double doors, the heavy oak bars still firmly in place. Outside, the plantation was waking up. He could hear the distant shouts of the house servants and the frantic ringing of the alarm bell at the master's manor. They saw the orange glow on the horizon. They thought the barn was burning. They didn't know the world was changing. Gideon gripped the oak bar. With a single heave, he lifted it. The doors swung open, and a rush of cool, midnight air flooded into the inferno. The oxygen hit the flames, creating a backdraft that sent a pillar of fire 100 feet into the sky. Gideon stepped out of the light and into the shadows. He looked back once. Through the wall of flame, he saw the silhouette of Silas Dockery, standing perfectly upright, his head held high by the iron spikes. It was the posture of a proud man, forced upon a coward in his final seconds. Gideon didn't run toward the woods. Not yet. He looked toward the big house, where Thaddeus Thorne was standing on the veranda in his nightgown, a telescope in one hand and a pistol in the other. Thorne was looking at the fire, but Gideon was looking at Thorne. For 16 months, Gideon had been a rebellious Negro to be controlled. Tonight, he was something else. He was the Iron Shadow, and he had one more debt to collect before the sun rose on a new Georgia. Thaddeus Thorne was a man who believed in the absolute divinity of his own bloodline. To him, the fire at the barn was an expensive inconvenience, a loss of property and tools. He didn't realize it was a funeral pyre for his entire world. "Dockery!" Thorne screamed into the darkness. "Where are the dogs? Where are the men?" The only answer was the rhythmic metallic clink of a heavy chain dragging across the gravel path. Thorne leveled his pistol toward the stairs. A figure emerged. From the smoke-filled night, it was Gideon. His chest was bare, coated in a layer of soot and ash that made him look like he was carved from obsidian. Around his neck, the skin was raw and red, but for the first time, His head was unburdened. "You," Thorn whispered, the pistol trembling. "Where is the collar, boy? How did you get out of the iron?" Gideon didn't stop walking. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying confidence of a man who had already seen the end of the story. "The iron didn't break, Master Thorn," Gideon said, his voice echoing off the white pillars. "The iron just found a new home," Thorn fired. The flash of the pistol blinded the night for a split second. The lead ball whistled past Gideon's ear, thudding into a wooden column behind him. Before Thorn could reach for a second weapon, Gideon was on the porch. He didn't use a knife. He didn't use a gun. He reached out with hands that had spent a year and a half squeezing the life out of Georgia cotton and the strength out of iron bars. He grabbed Thorn by the silk lapels of his nightgown and lifted him off the ground. "You bragged about that collar," Gideon hissed, his face inches from the terrified master's. "You told your friends it was the most effective method of control. You said a man can't rebel if he can't rest his head." Gideon dragged Thorn toward the edge of the veranda, pointing toward the roaring inferno of the barn. "Look at your work, Thaddeus. Your 9 overseers are resting now. They're resting in the fire you built." Thorn looked, and his eyes bulged. He saw the silhouette in the flames, the standing shadow of Silas Dockery, pinned by the spikes. He realized then that Gideon wasn't here to kill him. Not quickly, anyway. Gideon dropped Thorn back onto the porch. "I'm leaving this place tonight, and I'm taking every soul that wants to follow me. You can try to hunt us. You can send the hounds. You can send the militia." Gideon leaned down, picking up a discarded piece of the iron collar that had snapped off during the fight in the barn. He pressed the cold, jagged metal into Thorn's palm. "But remember this," Gideon whispered. "Every time you close your eyes in the dark, you'll hear the jingle of that chain. And you'll wonder, is the Iron Shadow back? Or is he just waiting for you to fall asleep?" Gideon turned his back on the master, a gesture of ultimate power. He walked toward the quarters, where 100 pairs of eyes were watching from the care of eyes were watching from the quarters, where 100 pairs of eyes were 100 pairs of eyes were watching from the cares of eyes were watching from the kerons. Darkness waiting for the signal that the world had finally turned upside down. Thaddeus Thorn sat on the floor of his porch, clutching the jagged shard of iron until it cut his palm. He watched in paralyzed silence as the wealth of his empire, the men, women, and children he claimed to own, walked past him. They didn't steal his silver. They didn't burn his house. They simply ignored him as if he were already a ghost in his own home. At the head of the line walked Gideon. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The Iron Shadow had become more than a man. He was a living warning dot as the sun began to peek over the horizon on October 29th. The militia finally arrived. They found the master of Thorn Ridge babbling incoherently on his veranda. When they reached the ruins of the tool barn, they found something that would haunt the state of Georgia for generations. 9 men had perished, but it was the sight of Silas Dockery that stopped the soldiers' hearts. He was found standing perfectly upright among the ashes, fused to a support beam by a collar that had no lock. The blacksmiths called to remove it shook their heads. The iron had been worked with such heat and such strength that it had become a permanent part of the man, The story of Amos, known to history as Gideon, became a whispered legend. For years after, whenever an overseer in Wilkes County grew too cruel, or a master reached for a new instrument of torture, they would catch a glimpse of a tall, wide-shouldered silhouette in the tree line. They would hear the phantom clink of a chain that wasn't there. The iron shadow was never caught. The hounds lost his scent at the edge of the Oconee River, and the professional slave catchers refused the contract. They had heard what happened to 9 men who thought they were guarding a broken slave. They knew that Gideon hadn't just escaped. He had evolved. Thaddeus Thorne spent the rest of his life behind iron bars of his own making. He turned his manor into a fortress, boarding up the windows and hiring a dozen armed guards to watch his door. But he never slept again. Every time his head touched the pillow, he felt the phantom prick of 4 jagged prongs against his neck. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, he heard Gideon's low, tectonic voice. The iron collar was meant to be a symbol of a master's absolute power. Instead, it became the tool of his absolute ruin. Because Gideon proved a truth that no amount of steel could change. You can chain a man's body, and you can weigh down his head, but you can never own the iron in his soul.